thing that I did want to stress as far as, the theme that we're hitting on today, what do non-California carriers need to know about the regulatory climate in California? I'm going to, in a brief moment, run through a whole gamut of regulations that the folks who are CTA members that I see in this room are very familiar with. It can be a little bit overwhelming to take it all in one sitting, but believe me, there are a lot of resources out there that can help you figure out what your responsibilities are, and this is not, an insurmountable challenge. With the right knowledge, you can make sure that you're doing everything you need to do to stay compliant with regulations in California. So number one, wanted to cover what I would consider some of the more minor regulations that we're faced with in the state of California. A lot of this stuff is, regulation that's been on the books for some time, but still can be overlooked by carriers when they're looking at what your responsibilities are with some of these other major regs that kind of get all the headlines. The first is the emission compliance label regulation that we have in California. This one is fairly straightforward. All engines manufactured in the United States, as well as engines that are specifically manufactured for California operations, have what's known as an emission compliance label. If any of you did any reporting to the Air Resources Board this year that asked for engine family number information like that, emission compliance label is where you went to get that information. If you're one of the lucky fleets out there that did not have to report to the Air Resources Board for the truck and bus rule this year, just to catch up on what this is, if you're going to operate in California, just add another line item into your annual maintenance checkup to make sure that that emission compliance label is legible, not damaged, because that's a really quick and easy fine that you can get from the California Air Resources Board. Another program that we have in California is known as the Periodic Smoke Inspection Program. This is limited to California-based fleets, and specifically to, if you're an interstate carrier, the trucks that are base plated in California. So if you have non-California base plates on a truck, they are supposed to be exempt, but that can be one of those exemptions that are missed by CARB enforcement. So if you feel that you're being unfairly targeted by this particular program, contact someone like us at CTA, your local trucking association, and get that cleared up. In a nutshell, there's a requirement for fleets of 2 or more diesel trucks that are over 14,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating to do annual smoke tests on all trucks that are over 4 model years old. So this year, for the first time, your 2008 model year engines are coming up against their smoke testing requirement. You need to retain records of your smoke tests for 2 years. And I just did want to mention that this is the #1 CARB moneymaker on the diesel enforcement program. You'd be amazed by how many people have just never even heard of this requirement, and is the first thing that you're going to be asked for when CARB enforcement comes to the door, because they can hit you for about $1,000 per truck right off the bat. So that's not a program you want to not comply with, because it's something that can cost you a significant amount of money. California, along with 47 other state and local jurisdictions, has a 5-minute idling limit. For those folks who have an automatic idle shutoff on your trucks, make sure that they're calibrated when you enter California to shut off before that 5-minute mark. The trucks that meet that optional clean idle certification can idle in the state, but no truck, regardless of whether or not it's clean idle, can idle within 100 feet of a residential area. So just make sure that anytime you're either delivering or operating near what could be considered a residential zoned area, that you're making sure that the idle limit is being respected. And then finally, the California Air Resources Board does set up at scale facilities in the state of California to test for smoke opacity levels being under 40% opacity, as well as they're going to take a look to see whether or not that emission compliance label is on that engine. So that heavy-duty vehicle inspection program is basically just the program that gives CARB the authority to take a look at your truck at a scale facility. So now we'll get into what are considered some of the more major regulations that California has. As Paul had mentioned on the last panel, there's a transport refrigeration unit, what the ATCM stands for is air toxic control measure. Basically, it's the regulation that requires controls on all reefer engines that are over 7 years old. Up to this point, due to the fact that all new reefer engines were being certified to this standard that's known as Tier 4I, that does not meet this final standard that the Air Resources Board wants you to get to, you only really had two options. Either you're going to be buying a retrofit or putting in a new engine that does not meet the final certification standard, meaning that no matter what, you were going to need to deal with an engine twice. Now, that's not going to be the case beginning next year. The reefer engine manufacturers are going to actually start putting out a Tier 4 final product where you can buy the brand new engine and not have to do something later on down the road 7 years later, whereas before there was nothing that you could buy where you weren't going to have to deal with it twice. So this year, the 2005 model year reefers are coming up against their compliance deadline. The way to read this, and it is very confusing because this is the one regulation they decided to set as the compliance deadline is 12/31 instead of January 1st. At the end of this year, 12/31/2012, your 2005 model year engines need to meet this ultra low emission standard. The way that they do that is to purchase a level 3 True retrofit, or again, you can go to either a engine repower, or if you can find one of those Tier 4 finals out there on the market at the time that you're trying to comply, that's another option that's available. So for the folks operating in California at the intermodal ports and rail yards, and to make matters a little bit more confusing, this is except the ports of Long Beach and LA, there's an advanced requirement that actually requires folks to go to a cleaner engine than the rest of the people in the state. The basics for this rule is that by 2014, in effect, there's going to be nothing operating in any port or rail yard in California that is older than a 2007 model year engine. The way to read these charts to your left or to my left is that the red means the engine is non-compliant. Yellow means the engine model year is compliant if retrofit for PM. And green means for that compliance year, that truck is legal. So you take a look at your Class 8s. What we're coming up against, and this one is your compliance year begins 1/1 of the particular year that we're looking at. As of 2013, 2005 and 2006 model year trucks or engines are not going to be able to enter any of the ports or rail yards in California unless they're either retrofit for PM or 2007 and newer. And I don't think that anyone's going to be buying a PM filter for a single year's compliance, so that really means that those 05s and 06s are going to be turned over to 2007s. There was some amendments recently that included previously exempt Class 7 trucks, whereas before, for whatever reason in the initial rule formation, they did not include Class 7s. Well, that has changed as of last year. Class 7s operating except in the South Coast, they're already included, pre-2007s, are going to be lumped into this rule beginning 1/1/2014. So that's another change. Another significant change for this rule is that there was the addition of what's known as the Drayoff amendment, whereas before, this rule only applied to trucks actually entering the facilities. That's no longer the case. Any container that is destined to or originating from an intermodal port or rail yard, any truck that's attached to that container is subject to this rule now. That's something that a lot of folks were caught off guard by, but that is in effect as of this past November. So it was specifically designed to stop what was known as street turns down the ports of LA and Long Beach, but this has been applied border to border. So it doesn't matter where that truck is operating. You could haul a container all the way out to the Central Valley with a compliant truck. When you hook up in the Central Valley with that container, you still need to have a port compliant truck as of today because of that amendment. So it's something to be aware of. So this is the real major rule that everyone is talking about right now, the statewide truck and bus rule. That basically governs emission standards for trucks operating no matter where you are, ports, ag, otherwise. This is the one that basically governs the emissions of any truck that enters the state of California. The schedules that are on the screen right now are what's known as the BACT schedules. That stands for Best Available Control Technology. These are really the baseline compliance schedules for this rule. There are a lot of, lesser known provisions, credits, little tricks you can play with this particular rule. But if you were to just say, hey, I don't want to report to the Air Resources Board, I really don't want to, take on the administrative burden of doing any of that, stuff with credits, this is the essentially the schedule that you'd be stuck with complying with. Class 4 through 6 trucks have a separate schedule, as you can see. There is no interim PM filter requirement, whereas for your Class 7s and 8s, the Air Resources Board is trying to clean up particulate matter from that truck population more quickly. So that's why you see two different compliance deadlines for Class 7s and 8s. But if you have your Class 4 through 6s, you're really just looking at, okay, well, when does my model year come up in that middle table? I got a 1999 model year engine. Well, as of 2019, I need to replace that engine with a 2010 or newer. So it's relatively straightforward. There's not a whole lot of, jazz to that one. Your Class 7s and 8s, here's an alternate visual of that schedule. Technically, as of today, there's really only one model year population that's subject to this rule. It's your 1996 through 1999 model year engines. So by this schedule, if you do not have any of those model year engines in your fleet, you are technically compliant with this schedule. So, you can see it's one of the odd situations that we came out of this rule with. If you have a 1995 model year engine, you are compliant without a retrofit until January 1st, 2016. But if you have a 1996 model year engine, you are not compliant today unless you have a PM filter on. So this is really mostly a schedule for the fleets that are going to naturally have, one of those 5 to 7 year turnover cycles. This does not, again, require any reporting to the Air Resources Board. It just requires you to stay ahead of the schedule. But just anecdotally, I would say there's very, very few fleets that I would actually expect to comply with this particular schedule. Most folks are going to be looking more toward this phase-in option. Well, let me back up for a moment before moving on from that. For the folks that are located out of state that are wondering, hey, I do a percentage of my business in California. I don't necessarily want to deal with the Air Resources Board if I don't have to. You can stay ahead of compliance with this rule simply by making sure that whatever you're dispatching into California complies with this schedule. So if you have a certain percentage of your fleet that is newer, and a certain percentage of your fleet that is older, I've seen this from some fleets that have mixed operations. If you can shuffle your older equipment out of state and just make sure that the new purchases are either coming to California or located in California, you can comply with the rule without necessarily having to do a whole lot of administrative work. So if that's something that sounds like it applies to your fleet, this is somewhat of a viable option rather than going this other route, which is what most of the folks who are located in California are likely doing. This is the phase-in turnover option, where basically you get a percentage of your fleet in compliance each year instead of having to do it all. And this is the scenario that you can kind of use to illustrate why this schedule is important. So let's say you got a fleet of 100 trucks, and they're all 1996 through 1999 model year engines. Under this scenario, you're having to replace every single one of those before this past January 1st, 2012, or retrofit them for PM. If that's not a viable option, and I'm sure that it's not, replacing 100 trucks all at once, you could have complied with this other option, that instead of having to do 100 trucks prior to last January, you had to do 30. So this is really the value of that phase-in turnover option. It allows you to kind of take compliance at a bite at a time. If you're using this option, I would really suggest doing what's known as a fleet calculator. It's an Excel spreadsheet tool that was released by the Air Resources Board that does all of the compliance calculation for your fleet. In the old days, before that tool came out, we actually used to, take out the pen and paper, ask what model years you had, do percentages, and then try to figure out the credits and the other provisions manually. Now, you just plug all your information into this fleet calculator. I mean, it'll tell you everything you need to know about your compliance with this particular schedule. And you can manipulate it to actually do your planning for future years. Let's say you want to see what your fleet looks like if you retire certain trucks that are in the fleet. Gonna do some purchases in 2013, a couple of retrofits. It'll do all the recalculation for you in future years. So it's really a valuable time saver as opposed to trying to figure all this stuff out manually like we used to have to do. So the other really major regulation, I would say that truck and bus is 1A. This next regulation is 1B as far as being big and expensive and costing a lot of administrative time. This is the tractor trailer greenhouse gas regulation. A lot of folks probably know it as either the Smart Way rule or that rule that's requiring side skirts. Who does this rule apply to? It's important to remember that this is not all trailers that operate in California. We're only talking about 53-foot and longer box-type trailers, dry and reefer vans. And then there's some requirements for the tractors that pull specifically those 53-footers. There are some shared responsibility statutes in place, or excuse me, regulations in place that loop in responsibility for not just the motor carrier, but also drivers, brokers, and then shippers that dispatch such equipment. We're still trying to hash out with the Air Resources Board what supply chain responsibility is supposed to look like, who are fines going to be assessed towards. A lot of that is still a conversation in progress because some of the AB 32 enforcement policy hasn't been put in place. Disclosure and record keeping requirements. This is important for anyone who's selling trailers in the state of California. There are some bits of language that you do actually need to include with your bill of sales to folks when you're selling this kind of equipment. Or leasing for the people that lease equipment as well. So make sure that you're up on the requirements there. This specifically does not apply to anything that is less than 53 feet. That's very important to remember. If you got a 52.5-foot trailer, you are exempt. This does not apply to a drop frame, chassis, flatbeds. So if you're wondering what portion of your equipment this is gonna apply to, just really stick to that 53-foot and longer box-type van. So how do we comply with this rule? There's a tractor side, and again, this is specific to tractors pulling 53-foot trailers. There's already some requirements that have been in place for some years. For the folks who are complying with the truck and bus rule, buying a lot of equipment, sleepers pulling 53-foot or longer trailers already have a requirement to be one of those Smart Way approved models. Regardless of whether or not it's a sleeper type cab, anything pulling a 53-footer right now, technically that's 2011 or newer, is supposed to have those EPA approved Smart Way tires, the low rolling resistance tires. So those mandates are in effect. There's been very little regulation, or excuse me, enforcement for this portion of the regs, so a lot of folks are kind of catching up on these requirements, but just be aware that as enforcement does ramp up, this is one of the requirements. There's a deadline coming up at the end of this year for any model year tractor, so this is new as well as the legacy fleet. Anything pulling a 53-footer is going to need those EPA Smart Way approved tires by the end of this year. And we're expecting an enforcement advisory to come out from the Air Resources Board that does explain that doesn't mean that you need to pull your power unit in and swap out some perfectly good tires with low rolling resistance tires. We're supposed to get an enforcement advisory that talks about any tire replacements that are done after 1/1/2013. That's what this is applying to. They're trying to work another advisory through their process right now, so we should be seeing that shortly. And then obviously there's also the trailer side to complying. And again, only 53-foot and longer trailers. Already, there's a requirement that your 2011 and newer trailers are either those SmartWay approved models that come with that specific suite of options that you can get from your trailer manufacturer, or have SmartWay tires in a combination of aerodynamic retrofits that get you either this 5% fuel saving for dry vans or 4% for a reefer. Then again, we got another major compliance deadline that's coming up for your 53-foot and longer trailers that are of older model years. As of the end of this year, if you're a large fleet that did not take part in one of those large fleet compliance plans, so that's 21 or more 53-foot box type vans, this is actually a deadline that's coming up for you. All of your trailers are going to need to be either SmartWay approved or have those aerodynamic technologies that get that 5% fuel savings or the 4% for reefers, with one notable exception being your 03 through 09 model year reefers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is a major, major deadline that a lot of folks have, overlooked simply because we're complying with whole lot of other stuff right now. But this is a requirement that's going to be out there. Again, if you did not submit one of those large fleet compliance plans in either July 2010, this past summer, or the final deadline that just passed on June 1st, all of your trailers are going to need to have, what's the most common option now is that side skirt. A lot of those advanced side skirts get 5% all on their own. That needs to be done by the end of this year. And then the tire requirement for the trailers is actually out in the future. For any of the 2010 and older model year trailers, your tire requirement does not come into effect until 2017. So there's the two sides of the trailers. You got to remember the aerodynamics are at the end of this year. Tires are 2017. So there are some exemptions to this rule. Not a whole lot of this is going to be usable for the folks outside of California. But again, operationally, we've seen a lot of very large fleets that have a lot of 53-foot trailers make some pretty big logistical changes just to avoid having a side skirt everything that comes into California. So these exemptions are mostly tailored for the in-state fleet. There's a short haul tractor exemption that if you have a tractor that goes under 50,000 miles annually, that tractor is exempt from the tire requirement. And then also any 53-foot or longer trailer that's pulled by that short haul tractor is similarly exempt. So if you run a pure, really short haul local operation and still do have 53s, this is the exemption that you would claim. There's a local haul tractor trailer exemption on the books right now. If you operate exclusively within a 100 land mile radius of your local haul base, and keep in mind that's land miles, not air miles like hours of service for the logbook exemption. Don't ask me why it's different. But if you operate exclusively within that radius, you're exempt from the side skirting requirement, but you would still need to keep up with the tire requirements for the lower end resistance tires. And then the last exemption is specific to drayage operations. If you're operating within 100 land miles of an intermodal port or rail yard and encounter 53s in that space, there's an exemption that applies to you as well. And then this is a pretty big one for anyone doing refrigerated hauling. If you got 03 through 09 model year trailers with an 03 or newer model year TRU, you're going to want to follow the schedules to your left, or to my left again. You get some additional time before needing to do the side skirting and install the tires. So if you do have model year reefers in that age range, do make sure that you're taking advantage of that exemption. And don't know if anyone in the room meets this definition, but there is a final compliance plan deadline for this rule that's coming into effect this fall. If you have 20 or less 53-foot or longer trailers, and that's not just operating in California, that's overall, there is a phase-in option that's similar to what the large fleets had for the last couple of years that's available to you. Instead of having to do all your side skirts by the end of this year, you can phase them in a quarter at a time over the next couple of years. It'll give you some additional time to come up with some capital to do that. You need to get that plan into the Air Resources Board by September 1st. And don't wait. If this is, you meet the definition of small fleet and you want to take advantage of this compliance plan, try to get that in as soon as possible. The original deadline was July 1st, but they're giving folks 2 more months to get that in. Then again, not to belabor the point, but these rules are really complicated. And this is the Air Resources Board's summary of just this tractor-trailer greenhouse gas rule that they think clarifies things for fleets. So, if that tells you anything about the thinking of some of the folks that do these rules, I don't know, what does. But I wanted to talk a bit about some lessons that I know that I've learned in this, if you want to call it the first real year of implementation for the truck and bus rule and some of this other stuff, the tractor-trailer greenhouse gas rule. Starting early, this is your typical best practice advice, but I cannot stress enough how bad it is when I get the call the day before something is due with a very, very legitimate issue from a carrier that if I had heard about that issue, let's say 90 days ago, 180 days ago, we probably would have been able to do something. I get these calls all the time, and it is, really human nature to kind of wait to the last second. But with these particular rules, it's not something you want to wait until the last second to do. There's a lot of margin for error. There's a lot of money on the line. There's a lot of issues that can come up just simply because these rules are extremely complicated. Do make sure that you try to start as early as possible. And with the truck and bus rule, there's a specific bit of advice that I would say is that if you're going to be ordering equipment for compliance, let's say that you go in the retrofit option, make sure that you get that equipment on order by September 1st of any given compliance year that you're coming up against, because you can apply for a delay in the case where a manufacturer says, well, your truck or your retrofit's not coming for 9 months and you're not going to make your compliance deadline. You can get an extension from the Air Resources Board if you did your ordering before September 1st, and that's a purchase order you would need to have on file, not just some kind of verbal arrangement to buy. Redundancy is just to say that we've had a lot of situations come up where I get a call and someone says, well, the guy who was in charge of this, he's no longer with the company, and I don't know what my passwords are for the reporting system, and I don't even know, what the person's name was, so, we're not going to be able to get into the reporting system and get to our info, and I need to report in the next 7 days. Just make sure that, as fleet owners, whoever is responsible for compliance, purchasing, reporting, that this person has some backups and that the information that they're entering into the system is being circulated, because you just don't want to duplicate work. I mean, it's a lot more of an issue to do this stuff 2 or 3 times than it is just to do it once and have a couple of people who are familiar. And one of the most common ways that people fail to do periodic smoke inspections, for instance, well, we had the one guy who knew that we had to do these on an annual basis. He left our shop, and now we haven't been doing them for the last 5, 6 years until we got fined. It's just amazing how much of this stuff leaves with people when they move on from your companies. So make sure that it's something that's ingrained in the staff who's taking care of this stuff, that you need to be training other folks about what you're doing, where to find the important information for compliance, so that you don't run into those situations where you're duplicating work. And then this is a big one, lean on industry resources. One seminar, one training session from CARB is not enough to get familiar with these regulations. I can tell you from firsthand experience, when I first came on with CTA, it probably took me 6 months of reading that truck and bus rule every single day and answering questions on it before I really started mastering what that thing was all about. But there's a lot of people like me out there who have been following these regs since the very beginning. A lot of folks from dealerships, there's some private consultants out there. Air Resources Board does have staff out there that knows a lot about the rules. Lean on those folks who have been doing a lot of the research along the way. And then here's my caveat to that. Trust what they say, but verify it. If you hear it from one person who knows a lot about the rules, that's good. If you hear it from 2 or 3, that's even better, because the bottom line is these rules are very complex and open for interpretation. And a lot of times it boils down to the guy who wrote the rule hasn't even thought about that particular issue, and he needs to figure out what the interpretation is. So, you know, if you hear something, don't just take it to the bank. Make sure that you either ask myself, ask someone at the dealer that has a lot of knowledge about it, ask the Air Resources Board. And this is unfortunate, but even if you hear something from the Air Resources Board, don't assume that it's actually the case. There's really only one or two folks that are in charge of these rules typically, and their interpretations at the end of the day are what matter, not what one of their field enforcement staff misinterpreted when they heard. So always make sure that you're, you know, the famous Ronald Reagan line, trust but verify. And that little picture in the bottom right corner is a guide that the CTA put together that basically has, you know, in as much plain English as possible, everything you need to know about these diesel compliance rules. We sent out copies of that guide to our membership database and also to the our fellow state trucking association. So if you are not located in California or not a CTA member, contact your local state trucking association. They should have a copy, and we update that guide every couple of months as new information comes out. And then, you know, the last bit of advice, get decision-making information in hands of decision makers. You don't want the only person that are on these mailing lists and on those listservs that have very, very important deadlines and very important information about compliance to be someone who, again, might be leaving in 6 months. You want to make sure that the person who's the ultimate purchaser, you know, I mean, it's your business. You need to make sure that someone is getting the proper information to make sure that you guys are not missing deadlines, not potentially costing yourself money by not getting something done by a particular time or by doing some kind of purchase that you did not need to do. These rules move very fast, and again, they're very complex, not to belabor the point. But it's very important to keep up on this just like you would any other major compliance issue, be it taxes, labor issues, you know, any of the above, safety. This is one of those programs that you really need to keep up on. So just a quick word on enforcement. This is a very common question. How much am I going to get fined if I get caught being in noncompliance? And the answer is each program actually has their own individual fine. And I wouldn't concentrate so much on what am I going to get fined for that one violation. Typically what happens is that the Air Resources Board uses a fleet audit model where what that field citation is going to trigger, so let's say that you get caught idling and you get written a $300 ticket by the Air Resources Board out in the field, that's not really the issue that you need to worry about. I mean, if you get a citation or a few, what's going to happen is that that's going to trigger follow-up from a separate division from the field folks that do full fleet audits, not just for a single program, but for every single program that you might be subject to. That picture right there is an actual letter from an actual fleet audit that this person had some citations out in the field that ended up triggering a full fleet audit for every single program. They got caught doing dry off, and now the situation that they're facing is, well, have you been doing everything? Fleet, you know, periodic smoke inspection. We want to see your truck and bus rule compliance. If you have any refrigerated equipment, we're going to follow up on the TRU rule. And what will happen is that they'll tally up all the fines from all of your compliance issues. And if they were to actually hit you with the full fine amount that they can hit you with by the law, I mean, anyone who got caught out of compliance with these things would be facing multi-million dollar fines. That's just the way that the statutes are written. But typically what they'll do is that they'll add up a 1 or 2 day fine amount that still ends up being very sizable in most cases, and they end up engaging in what's known as a settlement process, where you say, okay, well, don't fine me $150,000, fine me $75,000, and now I'm on the radar, and here's my compliance plan, and if I get caught again, ARB is going to throw the book at me. That's kind of the model that they've been using. And another important thing to know about enforcement is that, you know, if you're thinking right now, okay, well, am I going to get caught? You know, I can tell you this much, is that the Air Resources Board, their general philosophy is that they're going to find the carriers who are larger, typically because there's more bang for the buck, because of their enforcement structure. A lot of the fines come back to them in the Air Pollution Control Fund. And just because of the cost, and this is consistent across most government enforcement regimes, is that it has to be worth it for them to actually pursue you. It costs a lot of money to actually pursue someone all the way through the citation into the administrative law system and finally get an outcome. And they're really not willing to do that if it's just for one single citation for an owner-operator that's located in Montana. You know, they want to go after large fleets where they're going to get large cases. So, you know, it's something to consider. If you're large enough to be found, it's typically, you know, you're large enough to get fined. So it's just something to keep in mind. And just a brief bit about the future of California environmental regulation. I think it's very important with a lot of the panelists' comments earlier that we talk a bit about, you know, the future. Don't get me wrong, the regulations on the books are onerous enough and are costing folks enough money in the state of California, but we need to understand, operating out in California and in the West, if you want to do business in California, that there are some specific reasons why these regulations are in place, some specific reasons why we're facing additional regulation. And really what I'd say is that there's a challenge being put to the transportation sector, specifically commercial trucking, that if we don't really answer that call and say, okay, well, us as an industry, you know, let's harken back to what Dr. Asmus said, you know, private industry is going to come up with a solution to what we're going to do to this problem. We're just going to continue facing command and control regulation that has absolutely nothing to do with, you know, understanding what you guys do for your business. These folks don't know that there's different modes of trucking. They think that, well, everyone over the road replaces their trucks every 3 to 5 years. Why can't aggregate do the same? You know, this is the kind of thinking that goes in to what they do. So we really need to be proactive in looking at ways to meet the challenges that the regulators are currently just imposing on us. So some background right now about you know, some of the provisions of law that are going to be coming up in future years. There's a toxic side to diesel regulation that looks at, well, diesel particulate matter as a cancer-causing agent. There's some EPA regulations that are coming up that are going to be looking at cumulative impacts of pollutants, which really gets to a situation that we have very really bad problem with in Southern California is localized community impact. We have some very vocal and very active community groups along certain corridors in Los Angeles that are pushing for zero emission goods movement in freeways that in arterials that go through their neighborhoods. So we're going to be facing pressure on that front on the toxics end. On the greenhouse gas reduction end, Prop 23, which for the folks in California know, was a proposition that was put on the ballot a couple of years ago that would have rolled back AB 32, which is the authority of California to regulate greenhouse gases in the state. That prop was defeated on a 60-40 no vote. So the people of California have said, okay, well, we don't want to roll back this particular provisional law. So the state of California is still legally required to reach 1990 carbon emission levels by 2020 and authorizes further reductions beyond that 2020 timeframe. So what we're looking at on a statewide basis is about a 15% reduction in carbon from today until 2020, and that's on an absolute basis. So that's not accounting for any growth that occurs in the state. We just absolutely need to reduce emissions by 15% across all sectors. And transportation accounts for about 40 to 50% of those greenhouse gases. So again, you know, as far as meeting the challenge, you know, this is the kind of stuff that's out there imposing pressures on us. If you want to know why the regulations are in place, you can really start looking at some of these things. And then again, there's another additional layer, criteria pollutants. There's a federal provisional law known as the Clean Air Act that requires the entire United States to meet what's known as national ambient air quality standards. And despite the fact that California actually does have some of the best energy efficiency for our gross output of anywhere, not just in the United States, but the world, we have two of the most severely polluted areas in the United States when it comes to national air ambient quality standards for a couple of the criteria pollutants that are regulated by that act. The San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast air basins are the two big problem areas. And just, again, trucks' contributions to this problems and why they're coming after us. Heavy-duty trucks are blamed for about 25% to 50% of all the NOx in the Central Valley. So, they are going to be coming after us for future reductions. It's not, if, it's when. So I don't want to proclaim to be able to tell you exactly what's going to happen in California regulation in the coming years, but there are some things that we think we can tell you that will guide some of the decision-making processes that go forward. I think that Noel Massey's comments about you can't wait around for the regulators. We really need to find some way within not only our industry, but the engine manufacturer industry and the fuel industry to come up with some solutions that are actually going to work for commercial trucking. Some of the regulatory pressures that we might be seeing, I think personally that we're probably going to be seeing a pause on new emission standards for trucks in the state until at least 2023 when that truck and bus rule expires. Now, I wrote this 3 days ago, and just to tell you how fast things move in environmental regulation, I read a report out of the South Coast AQMD that they're looking at trying to accelerate the drayage truck rule to electrify near-dock rail operations. So, anyone who services from the port to the near-dock rail yards, that's what they're pushing for, and that they want that to go into effect by 2020. So, these pressures are going to be constant on us. I think on the statewide level, we're going to have a reprieve until at least 2023. And so I would look at this 11-year time frame from now until 2023 as a very critical time for our industry to figure out, okay, well, we've heard what the regulators have to say to us. Now, what are we as private entities going to say is the solution to the problems that we know we're facing? The low carbon fuel standard. This is another one of those issues where, if you let the government decide the rules of the game, this is the kind of policy you're going to end up with. The Air Resources Board, just in a nutshell, the CTA did a study to take a look at the price impact from this particular fuel policy, and we found out that we're probably looking at about a $2 per gallon price increase for the price of diesel by 2020. And the reason that is that the LCFS, as it's known, basically says that regardless of how expensive an alternative fuel is, if its carbon intensity is low, it's requiring fuel suppliers to blend that fuel into the California fuel supply. So the requirement that you have to meet is a 10% reduction in carbon intensity. And so, this is just one of those questions that you have to ask to the state of California and regulators and see if it resonates with them. If we could get an 8% reduction in carbon intensity and provide folks in California with cheaper fuel, would it be worth it, or should we make everyone fill up with something that's more expensive and get a 10% reduction? Right now, it doesn't matter. You got to get that 10% reduction, so that's the way that the policy is set up. But without private voices pushing back to say, we have no inherent problem with things like alternative fuel, it's just we need to be able to conduct our business. And ideally, you would incentivize folks who are in the space like alternative fuel, hey, provide us with an alternative fuel that's low carbon and cheaper, and we'll be your biggest champion. And that's kind of the issue that we're facing right now with the low carbon fuel standard, and hopefully we're going to get somewhere with that. But some of the outcomes that we're going to be seeing is that the low carbon fuel standard in California is either going to end up being a mandate for increased biodiesel blending up to B20, or if there's some kind of quantum leap in technology, we could be looking at renewable drop-in diesel replacements, which, if they're cost effective, could be an absolute game changer for the greenhouse gas issues for transportation. So we're hoping that something's going to come out, but just with the way that these policies are designed right now, we just don't know what's going to happen. And until biofuels get cheaper, California diesel is going to get more expensive. So I was joking with some folks earlier, if you want a good business opportunity, set up a fueling station at the border of California. You're going to get all kinds of business starting soon. So another thing, even as we look forward to things like LNG, there are some issues that we're going to need to address. Methane leakage from not just the drilling process, but also from trucks. LNG actually does, LNG trucks do actually emit a bit of methane just from their normal usage and getting rid of some of the tank pressure. This is something that I think that the trucking industry needs to be proactive to make sure that we don't wait for the regulators to find this as a problem and protect our initial investments in LNG trucks by addressing methane leakage. And then the Air Resources Board is going to keep coming after us. There's a focus on goods movement that's reflected in the fact that they actually created a new freight branch in 2011, and their stated goal is to identify opportunities for zero and near zero emission technologies in goods movement, even though the technology pathway is just simply not there. You know, there's some things being discussed right now. This previous slide is actually the Siemens e-highway concept that they're currently exploring in the Port of Los Angeles. But really, there's a lot of space for folks who are actually running this technology, running trucks, to come in and say, this is the policy that's going to work for us. It's going to get X amount of reductions, and you're not going to just simply put everyone out of business with a truck that runs 6 hours and can't run a full duty cycle, or can only haul 40,000 pounds, whatever the case may be. And for folks outside of California, I hate to say, the direction of worldwide politics with worldwide focus on global warming, greenhouse gases. The California Air Resources Board was actually invited to the G8 summit a month ago to talk about diesel emissions being a source of black carbon, which is, the new thing that they're talking about is short-lived climate forcers. So moving beyond carbon into stuff like methane, black carbon, some of the other pollutants. So as far as, is the focus going to go off diesel once these rules are, in place, and is it just going to be California's issue? It's kind of gone global now. So, what's started in California, it looks like it may spread just on the basis of there's a greenhouse gas reduction angle to retrofitting and things of that nature now. So if there are any questions in the audience, I'd be happy to take them.
Very good, very informative talk. Thank you. Number one, you haven't addressed regulations for APUs for idle reduction. What do you see coming down the pike on that?
There's already emission standards that apply to APUs. Did you mean in a different sense, or?
Well, anything for the future retrofits, if you've got, say, a 5, 6, 7-year-old APU, what do you have to do to it to make it compliant?
I don't see a separate rule for APUs being done anytime soon. The whole suite of diesel regulations is really all set right now. So as far as an additional program to go back after APUs in an additional capacity, I don't really see. But there are some emission standards that APUs have to meet currently.
Okay, and you mentioned the statistic that about 1/3 of NOx pollution comes from trucks. Well, that's old technology. There's a lot of old engines out there. Is that what that retrofit is all about? Or,
Yeah, the NOx number in the Central Valley, when taking into account all the fleet turnover, they expect the contribution to go down from about 50% to 25%. So even though our contribution is going to go down by a ton, and I did want to mention that one thing that we really need to start doing in the trucking sector is talking about the incredible amount of emission reductions that have been done up to this point, even though we're acknowledging that we're going to move beyond what we've done. If you look at trucking versus any other freight mode that we compete with, I mean, the reductions that trucking has done dwarf any of those other sectors, and that's something that does need to be reemphasized. But still, we're going to have challenges in places like the Central Valley where a lot of their ozone attainment issues for Clean Air Act compliance do stem from heavy-duty trucking.
My question is about Class 7 and 8 trucks, highway trucks. Obviously, by your chart, there's compliance issues right now, but where are they enforcing these? You know, you don't see any activity in enforcement, and I think you got a big event January 1st, 2014, when 2,000 trucks are no longer compliant.
Yeah.
Where are they inspected? You know, what kind of enforcement are you seeing?
Well, their field enforcement officers are supposed to be set up at places like scales. If they hear from somebody, well, I saw some dray off occurring here, or we think this company is non-compliant, they'll go out and investigate. They have a separate branch that just does paper audits, that for whatever reason someone got on their map and they send this letter that says we want, you know, 10,000 pages of documentation showing, you know, where you've been and what technology you've been using. But the bottom line is, I mean, the Air Resources Board enforcement staff is not the Highway Patrol. They don't have the manpower to be out there, you know, on the side of the road. They don't have the power to actually pull people over. So, you know, as far as enforcement, I mean, it's going to be intermittent at best. Yeah, the non-compliance rate for something like the TRU rule, what they're willing to admit to is about 40% right now. So as far as, you know, whether or not they're going to be able to actually get these rules complied with, it's not only an issue for competitiveness. There's the possibility that if people in the wrong position get the perception that these rules are unenforceable, they can actually be pulled out of some of the federal compliance documents that they've been put in. And we could be looking at a brand new rule formation that would be even more stringent than what we have today. So, you know, as far as figuring out how the rules are going to be enforced and making CARB actually live up to what they're making everyone do in the room do, that's going to be a big, big issue for us coming up.
Chris, as you know, I get to speak on a panel tomorrow about natural gas as a solution, but I want to emphasize the point you were making today about communication with the Air Resources Board and not letting a phone conversation be all you do if you're having an issue with the Air Resources Board. If you can't get the person you're talking to send you an email, explaining whatever the issue is in writing or summarizing the issue in writing, you need to do that. You need to send that email to them saying, this is what I heard you say today. That written record is really important if you have a bigger problem down the road. And given the complexity of this rule, the changing staff, the confusion even within the same department at the Air Resources Board about some of these elements, that email or written chain is something that I would strongly encourage.
Absolutely. You know, if someone in field enforcement tells you something that ends up being wrong down the road, you can guarantee that they're going to say, "Nah, I didn't say that," later on down the road. So yeah, make sure you get in writing. And, you know, not to further, you know, shake everyone's confidence in the competence of field staff, but we actually had our first major enforcement action for dray-off. I believe it was in January, where they sent a bunch of CARB enforcement, Highway Patrol, Caltrans was involved because it was at a weigh station. I'm sure this enforcement action costs a lot of money to the state. And ARB enforcement actually was enforcing the wrong rule. They got the standards wrong. So the couple of tickets they wrote out of it, they had to rescind. So just to tell you, I mean, these rules are so complex that when the person who wrote the rule is trying to relate it to the person who's supposed to enforce it, they can get a lot of things wrong. You know, so again, make sure that you're checking with your industry resources, anything that you're hearing from them. 2 or 3 people, if you hear it from them, you can kind of take it to the bank. But otherwise, just don't trust a lot of what you hear, especially on the rumor mill about these rules. You got to get it straight from the source and then even back it up from that point.
Hey, Chris. Can you hear?
Hey, Wayne.
Hey, as usual, Chris, thanks. Great job. I want to make a quick pitch and then a statement. Everybody in this room should be an active CTA member because for those of us that are, Chris and his predecessor kept us out of trouble. For the company I work for, I saved $500,000 as a member, and half of that goes against this truck and bus rule. And I want to just back up something Chris said earlier about the fines. And you had asked over here about how are they gonna police this. We got hit with a $30,000 fine on the snap test rule. Something that's been out since like '98 or '99, and really nobody paid attention to it. I was in business for myself then, I bought a machine to do other people's testing. There was no enforcement, so we lost money on the machine. Well, when the cart was getting low on funds, they hired 4 people. Those 4 people got on the phone, called and asked for the receipts from your snap testing. And when we didn't have them, because we hadn't been doing it for 10 years, they cut payment down. We got $30,000 fine. So I think what happens with them and their enforcement is when they see a pile of cash somewhere and an easy way to go after it, that's what they're gonna do because they are self-funding through their fines. Am I correct on that, Chris?
Yes. Yeah, they're,
He's not crying wolf when he says, keep an eye on these guys, because when they need cash, they don't have to go to a legislative body for approval to fine us. They just have to find some reason, they throw the fine, and you don't have enough money in your legal fund to fight it. So, just want to reiterate that again, Chris, great job. Thank you.
thanks, Wayne. And, you know, part of what we're going to really be concentrating on as we're turning toward enforcement is the ARB's enforcement policy does not make sense in a lot of different ways. You can be compliant with, let's say, the drayage truck rule. You can have a 2012 brand new truck, meets all emission standards. If you forget to register that truck in the drayage truck registry with the ARB, you're still subject to a fine, even though there's been no air quality violation. So, you know, getting this enforcement program under control, doing what it's supposed to do, and avoiding a lot of the pitfalls that we can see them heading toward right now, where they're going to be asking for a lot of extraneous documentation and just harassing people who are trying to be compliant while letting guys who have no plan to be compliant fly under the radar. That's really what we're going to need to concentrate on to try to get these guys in line to say, hey, you know what, if someone does not have an air quality violation and it's an administrative issue, should we really be fining them? Or should we just get them into the system and call it even? You know, those are the kind of things that you'd be shocked that it's very difficult to get to the Air Resources Board to see the sense in that. But, you know, that's what we're working on right now, trying to improve the relationship there.
Speaking to the SmartWay rule on exemptions, especially on the refrigerated trailers between 03 and 09, do you have to apply for that exemption? And same question for the 100 air mile radius for the 53-foot vans.
The refrigerated trailer exemption, no. Basically, if you get pulled over and they see, okay, well, you have this 03 model year reefer, they're supposed to just let you go. There is, confusingly enough, and I have not gotten a response back to why they did this, there's a slot if you go on the truckers reporting website right now for reporting those reefer trailers, but I do have it in writing from them months ago saying you didn't need to report. So I'm going to be following up with them to try to get more clarity on that. But the actual in-writing interpretation was you did not need to report to take advantage of that exemption. Now, the other exemptions you do for several reasons. For the short haul exemption, you need to report your mileage to basically, you know, show the Air Resources Board your trucks are not going over 50,000 miles a year. The local haul tractor trailer exemption, you need to actually designate where that local haul is going to be so that they can, you know, at a future date, determine whether or not you traveled outside of that radius. So those do require reporting.
Okay, any other questions for Chris?
Sorry, I could have probably just pulled you aside in the hall. If we had an operation where the customer owns the trailer, we own the power, who are they going to come talk to about compliance with the short haul tractor exemption? Who should have been registering that trailer?
The trailer registration is the responsibility of that owner. And then you guys are registering your power unit if you're going under the 50,000 miles. Would the combination meet that particular definition, so the 50,000? So yeah, I mean, if there's something worked out between you and the customer to where, look, you know, we've been in business for 5 years together and we've never done more than 20,000 miles on a power unit that we've used for your account, that can be something that's worked out to where they register as, you know, or, I mean, this is where it starts getting a little bit more complicated. I mean, you're registering yourself as the short haul tractor, and then if that trailer is being pulled by that tractor, it is exempt. But if it gets disconnected at any time and is pulled by some other company that, let's say, goes 70,000 miles annually and didn't register, then that trailer immediately becomes non-compliant. So, you know, a lot of this stuff is going to be worked out in the initial enforcement phases, but if that's something that's going to work out where that trailer is never going to be away from that tractor, then it's something that you guys could work out as possibly being exempt. And we do need to talk about that a little bit more, because I want to make sure that that's you know, done correctly with the Air Resources Board, that they get what's going on.
Chris, there's a lot of good information on those slides. I had the luxury of sitting in the front row and could see everything, but when I was standing in the back looking, they weren't all readily visible.
Sure.
Is this going to be available after the presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be more than happy to send this presentation to anyone who wanted it. And then again, a little bit more comprehensive is the guide that we put together. It has a lot more detail on the various rules. I got a copy of it here right now. You can get it through CTA or, again, through your local state trucking association. I do want to make a plug for the Nevada Trucking Association as well. You know, any of your local advocacy groups are a great resource for information. And if you're a member of the Nevada Trucking Association, you should be able to get a copy of this.